The next folks coming up, I'm going to let Bill Brandt introduce his panel. Bill is the Director of Strategic Integration at ASU LightWorks, but have no fear, he's not an academic. He's a Wharton MBA with a 30-year energy background, and glad that he's chairing this or moderating this group. Go ahead, Bill, and introduce the rest of your team if you'd like.
Great, thanks very much, appreciate that. Wasn't it great that we had Teddy Roosevelt here today? Do what you can with what you have where you are, and I think that's kind of like a really good thing for us when we sort of think about this panel. And can you imagine what it was like 50 years ago when you were in the solar industry, sitting around sort of thinking about where is this going to go, and now we're talking about less than 3 cents in some places? That's pretty cool too. So this panel is going to try to stretch your imagination to the future and think about it. So what I want to do is introduce my panelists, Noah Deich with the Center for Carbon Removal, Klaus Lackner at ASU, the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions, and Ellen Stechel, who is a director at ASU LightWorks. So we're going to start out by letting Noah take the lead and take us into the future.
Of course. Thanks, Bill. So hi, everyone. I'm Noah Deich with the Center for Carbon Removal. For those that don't know us, we're a nonprofit based in California working to clean up carbon from the atmosphere. We look at forestry and agriculture solutions as well as carbon capture technology, which is what we're going to talk about here on this panel. So I'd actually like to start and open it up to the floor. When you think of carbon capture, what comes to mind? And I'll ask people to just yell out one word about what they think about when they think carbon capture. Photosynthesis, clever. We'll come back to that.
Carbon capture and sequestration.
Exactly. And we think of what we've heard from most people is fossil fuels, basically. How do we continue to burn those 4 million lumps of coal a second indefinitely? Because that's the only way that people saw us solving this climate change. I think that story is one of the past. And when I think of carbon capture today, what comes to mind for me is the next industrial revolution. That the first industrial revolution over the past 150 years, it did start with coal. Oil accelerated it. It's now being transformed by the photon. But that's not where it's going to end. That even if we have a clean, bright energy future, planet's still going to be too warm. We saw the charts there. We're going to need to figure out how to harness the CO2 that's in the atmosphere and transform that into valuable materials. And I think photosynthesis is actually a great paradigm. So many people tell me that they don't think carbon capture is possible. But it turns out that trees are quite good at it. They've had a couple 100 million years of R&D. They're literally field tested. They work. This is not a rocket science problem. What we need to do is figure out how, in the same way that trees build themselves, literally with only sunlight, water, air, and soil, how can we construct our future, our buildings, our products, and clean up the atmosphere at the same time with those same elements? Use all of the renewable energy that we are creating and are continuously coming down in price to figure out how to construct the built environment and the economy of the future. And I think that story actually plays out in what's happening on the ground. So today, there are maybe 3 power plants in North America that are coal power plants with carbon capture. I don't think there are any other that are in the planning stages or close to operation. So it's not like, hey, this isn't a clean coal story. Oh, and by the way, there are dozens of clean coal plants under operation. No, that's not where the industry is headed. Where we see change actually happening for carbon capture is industry today. We see the Gulf Coast thinking about how they can use their CO2 to manufacture the chemicals, the plastics, fuels that they produce today. We see ethanol refineries making biofuels and trying to sell that CO2 as yet another co-product like ethanol facilities do. And I think what we're seeing with the carbon capture story today is the first step on that pathway to a completely different economy that harnesses CO2 as a useful and valuable product. And I think it requires all of us to revisit how we want to engage in carbon capture today. What we're seeing is we're learning how to walk right now with carbon capture. We're not going to be able to run and build all of our cars and our buildings and all of our economy out of carbon overnight. We have to invest in that research and development. As Bill said, it's a multi-decadal process. And right now, we are grossly under-investing in this future. And to me, it's not a technical challenge. It's really a social will challenge. How do we get this vision of a carbon sequestering and growing and prosperous economy to be the one that we start investing in today? Not just from government, but from the private sector, from philanthropy, from all of these different stakeholders that do need to collaborate to make this real. So with that, I'll pause there and pass it down to Klaus to share a little bit more about what exactly that future of carbon capture might look like.
Thank you. I'm the director for the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. So as you might imagine, I am thinking about how to get carbon back out of the environment. When I started to think about it, it was very clear already in the 90s that we have a finite carbon budget, and we have a carbon credit card, if you wish, which by now is in overdraft. If it not is quite in overdraft, it will be pretty soon. So we have to figure out how to balance the books. And if you really want to close the carbon cycle, you will need to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And my own interest is to do that directly by chemical means, by technical means. And so it augments biological capture, which is photosynthesis. And the reason it's interesting, our mechanical or artificial trees are about 1,000 times faster as they stand in the wind in sucking up CO2 than a natural tree. It's just like a horse is very good at pulling a plow, a tractor is better at it, and we are dedicated to solving this problem, and so we can do it significantly faster than the leaves of a tree, which also has to keep the tree alive and do all of these other things. We are just specialists in collecting the CO2. So the question then is that a way of closing the carbon cycle? I think we could scale up to the necessary scale. How much can be done more cheaply is another question. But if push came to shove, I think air capture could balance out, if it had to, of what is being done today and also pay back the old carbon debt. It is quite possible that we have to come back by 100 ppm back down, which means we have to collect more CO2 and find a place to store it than we emitted in the 20th century. I'm not directly addressing this here. I'm just talking about how to get the CO2 out of the air. Is that technically feasible? The answer is, of course, it's technically feasible. We know that because submarines are doing this all the time. There's too much CO2 in the air, so they pull it out. Spacecraft do the same. And by the way, if you make liquid air, you have to first remove the CO2 and the water vapor from it, because otherwise you have sand in that liquid air, because CO2 and water will long have frozen into a solid before you get as cold as liquid air. So technically it can be done. The real challenge is to do it in a way that is actually affordable. And so what we are working on is to get to technologies which are quite different than what we normally do for separation technologies, which are cheap enough to accomplish this goal. We are working on our particular one at ASU, which of course I'm biased in favor of because I like it, I invented it. There are colleagues who have started this because I basically told them this is a great idea, and they said we can do it too. And so now there are 5 or 6 groups doing it, and people argue what it will cost. The American Physical Society in 2011 said, if we do it by this particular very harsh and complex process, it's going to cost us $600 a ton, and nobody would argue that's affordable. On the other hand, is that glass half full or is it half empty? I would say it's half full, because if you look at photovoltaics, it started 100 times as expensive as it is today. And if you were to get from $600 to $60, you are looking like you're in pretty good shape. $100 a ton of CO2 would ask you to pay 85 cents extra on a gallon of gasoline. If you can get it down to $30 a ton of CO2, you would be asked at the pump to pay an extra 25 cents, and you could balance the carbon balance of this particular problem. So we think we can get there. Right now, our technology is in the laboratory scale. Some of the others are prototypes out there. They're not $600, they're maybe $300. Graciela was here last year. They think they are at $70 a ton of CO2. We'll find out when things get really commercial. But I would argue if you look at the experience of the learning curve, things can come down much, much faster than we think if we are willing to go that route. So we believe this could be done. Then the next question is, what is it good for? Well, first and foremost, if you want the vision Noah just laid out, and you want to make lots of good things with carbon as the feedstock and use the air as the mine from which you extract the carbon as CO2, well, then you need air capture to pull it out. We come and say we can do that. I also think, since we are 100 ppm above, some of the CO2 we will have to put away. And from Noah's perspective, that's actually a very good thing, because if I have to do waste management and put CO2 in a waste disposal, because we have already too much garbage out there, well, then it costs money, and that will add to the price. And that price is an extra bonus, and if you want to make liquid fuels, you get that bonus because you didn't have to bury it. So all told, I think we can do all of that, and that will actually change the debate, because now if you are an emitter, you can say it's very difficult, and I know you don't really want to pay for it. If you have air capture, you can say, well, you don't have to do it. We'll do it for you, and by the way, we present you with a bill. And you will see that many applications will say, well, we can do this more cheaply than letting it out in the atmosphere and taking it back. So overall, I think this puts us in a very good position. And then in the end, we need to get it started. And if I look again at photovoltaics, if you ask, how did it happen? It happened with people who knew and I listened yesterday to the discussion. And, well, investors don't invest unless it's a proven technology. But if you go back in the 1960s, people put photovoltaic panels on their house because they believed in it. They knew that they paid more for that electricity than for ordinary electricity. To this day, people pay extra for renewable electricity. So I'm asking that we need to find people who are saying, I am volunteering. If I take a hot shower with my natural gas-fired water heater, or if I drive my car and put in a gallon of gasoline, I should pay for the extra 20 pounds of CO2 I just committed to. And if only 1% of the people do this, we can come down the learning curve and get somewhere and actually then start utilizing carbon. And I give it to you at this point.
All right. Hi, I'm Ellen Stechel from the ASU LightWorks initiative in the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute on Sustainability. And it's a real honor to be here. And I guess I was lucky because someone dropped off of this panel. Although both Noah and Klaus gave you, I think, quite a synopsis of the vision that we're talking about here. If you think about, mostly when you think about CCS, as was mentioned, most people think about trying to bury the CO2 and put it out of sight, which is a pure liability. What Noah and Klaus and I were talking about is, how do we turn this into a valuable feedstock? It is picking up on the vision of, well, the Earth has done this for many, many years through photosynthesis. But photosynthesis, surprisingly, people don't realize, is actually quite inefficient. It's like 1%. It can feed the world, hopefully, but feeding and fueling the world on photosynthesis is hard to imagine. As Klaus mentioned, so if you can capture it 1,000 times faster than trees, and then if we can convert it into products 10 times more efficiently with a lot less water, then we have the beginnings of a real new industrial revolution. I think Noah mentioned that. The next industrial revolution is going to be around carbon. Carbon is by far the most versatile element. I am a chemist by background, and it is my favorite element on the periodic table because you can do almost anything with it. It bounds with just about any other element, but it can be reactive if you need it to be. It can be totally inert if you need it to be. It can be very strong. It can be very flexible. It won't corrode. You can do virtually anything with carbon that we do today with either fossil, steel, or concrete. So right now, we do have a fledgling, a CO2 market. CO2 is used, the first place it's used is really in enhanced oil recovery, and that's maybe 40 megatons. That's not going to scale. It's not going to get us there, but it can get us started. There's CO2 for greenhouses, again, can push us further. The total market right now for CO2, we estimate, while the enhanced oil recovery is about 40 megatons, all of the other applications, probably the largest one is making urea from ammonia and CO2. The total market right now is 40 megatons. We've got to get it to go to gigatons, tens of gigatons. But that's possible if we do start getting it into fuels and materials such as carbon composites. These are materials, right now, it's a market that is taking off. It is already a little bit too expensive from the feedstocks it's doing, but it's coming down its learning curve. If we can get onto that learning curve and start making it from CO2, that market has sort of endless possibilities to scale to the same size. And therein, you have a solution that makes lots of money for lots of people, is like, it's hard to imagine a lot of unintended consequences, but anything at scale usually does. But it could get us where we need to do. If we recycle CO2 back into fuels, that of course is not, that's not negative, but it also keeps fuels in the market who have a lot of good properties. I'm surprised Klaus didn't make one comment where he says we have to get to is 1 ton up is 1 ton down, or 1 ton up is more than 1 ton done. But if we make fuels, capturing it from the air, using renewables, then 1 ton up can be 1 ton down. We make other products, 1 ton up, more than 1 ton down. So that's kind of the vision. It's mostly in the lab right now. I think it's been mentioned. If we can start investing in the R&D, it's a future where everybody can prosper. But it's kind of not known. So that's what we're here for.
So thanks, Ellen, for that comment. And it's like really important when you're running a business, you have to get to revenue, because if you don't get to revenue, you don't run a business. But at the same time, what we've got to do now is begin to create the framework for how these industries, or how this industry can get started. So Noah, are there some things that we could do from a regulatory perspective that might help?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that we can start doing today from the federal government level that would really move the needle when it comes to this future of carbon capture. So as one statistic, the Department of Energy in its entire history has spent about $3 million on the direct air capture work that Klaus does. Every year, the Department of Energy spends billions of dollars a year on overall energy, R&D, and innovation. That gap is massive, and we will never catch up to where we need to be and unlock the promise without a real research investment in these advanced carbon capture systems. I think one of the reasons that that investment has been held up is because Congress has said carbon capture is for coal. It's the only work that happens at the Department of Energy is under the coal program for carbon capture. So that means that it's very, very difficult for any research on the things that Eleanor is talking about, on direct air capture, on industry, and even natural gas. It was brought up earlier, natural gas is this bridge fuel. Well, it turns out that natural gas is better than coal from an emissions perspective, but only 50%. And we're not talking about how do we reduce emissions by 50%. We need to get rid of all of our emissions. And so we need to figure out how to put carbon capture on the full range of sources that are out there today. And until we change these small regulatory tweaks that are out there, it's just not going to happen. And I think one of the most encouraging things is if you look at what the the tiny minority of congressional representatives that are interested in this future of carbon capture, it's incredibly bipartisan. So a senator from Wyoming and a senator from Hawaii, probably the two farthest ends of the ideological spectrum, have partnered to create a $50 million direct air capture innovation prize. If Congress ever actually passed legislation, it'd probably get through. It made it through the energy bill in the Senate last year. Just the whole bill itself didn't come to the floor. So what we're talking about is this really breaks the paradigm of in what camp are you? Are you the Greens? Are you industry? Are you Democrat, Republican? No, this is everyone can participate in this vision of a new carbon economy. And what we've seen is that actually is happening today in these little bits and pieces. So I'm actually encouraged that even in this political climate, we can make those small and tactical regulatory tweaks so that we can start funding this stuff today at a level that really starts to move the needle.
So it's not so much about the cost, it's about the new carbon economy and how do you get there. Klaus, have you got some thoughts about?
I think it's a little bit about both, because the fundamental problem you have is any new technology starts life very expensive. This is the nature of being new. And somehow, when you talk about political processes, regulatory processes, they would like to start at a low price and work themselves up. Now, the more you do, the other price will come down. And that's in part why I'm so interested in also seeing it in part as a waste management issue. I'm not taking back that making useful things out of it is, of course, the best thing you can possibly do. But even then, if you are looking at it, usually I could have started with coal or oil or gas, and it would have been a little cheaper, right? So in a way, we have to then always motivate it by wanting to get the carbon down. And I also think we shouldn't be thinking we are off the hook. We said we thought about recycling, we couldn't do it. We pushed the efficiency as far as we could, and we still have some emissions, and we can't reduce any further, and so therefore we are now off the hook, right? At that point, we should say, and now you have to dispose of it. And that will put value on the CO2, and that's where we have to start. And I think you have to find volunteers.
So I'm actually, I think Klaus and I actually might disagree a bit on this.
Great.
Yeah, so when we talk about climate policies in the past, the things that move the needle are not carbon prices. They're renewable portfolio standards, which are not priced in dollars per ton CO2. They are tax incentives, not priced in dollars per ton CO2. If you convert those dollar per megawatt hour renewable portfolio standards, if you convert PTC, ITC credits into what their dollar per ton cost is, it's hundreds of dollars. The California RPS program was estimated at $133 a ton CO2. There are some battery electric vehicle subsidies that end up being over $500 a ton CO2. If you put that as the prize for direct air capture, I'm sure you could get technologies to deliver at that level today. And I think that's a fundamental reframing where carbon capture has always been about cost. What's the CO2 cost? And the shift that we need to make is what's the value in the carbon capture? How much more do we value innovative products that come from the sky, not from the ground? How much more do we value our food to come from agricultural systems that sequester carbon? And we don't have to talk about that explicit carbon price to get started. Our goal is to figure out how we go from 0 to 1 in many of these situations, start to come down that learning curve. And once we do that, I think it actually marries these two approaches nicely because it starts to give us a carbon price that can actually make a difference and is politically feasible. Because at the end of the day, no politician is going to go out there and say, hey, I'm going to double your gas price. It's now $400 a ton CO2 price. Like that's just not going to happen. And what we need to do is figure out the feasible way to get started and bring that cost down so it's not that sticker shock at the end of the day.
And there are many different ways of getting there, and I agree with you that is important, but at the other end, you have the technologies which will, by nature, start out expensive, and we have to figure out how to integrate them. And part of it could be that you say, I'm only taking 10% of the CO2 back in the beginning, and as I get better, I'll take 100%.
So the benefit is in the system that
Yes.
we've got. So the one thing I want to do is want to make sure that the system works with us too here, and we've got the audience out here, and I want to make sure that we've got a couple questions from them.
Is there an area in the atmosphere where carbon concentrates more than the other, or towards like?
It mixes incredibly well. So well, if you stand right downwind of a power plant, you can tell, but it's like 5% change. Right? But if you look at it overall, it takes the CO2 on the latitude to go around the Earth a couple of weeks. In 6 months, it's all over the hemisphere. In 2 years, it's in the southern hemisphere and in the northern hemisphere. And we know that because you heard earlier, there's a station measuring CO2 in Antarctica, and it lags the northern hemisphere by about 2 years.
And the second question is, could you go straight to the source of these majors who are taking the carbon out of the ground in the first place and get them to be responsible for funding the carbon capture?
I personally think that's, in the end, the optimal way of doing it. I would argue this goes to the thing I didn't say, you wondered why I didn't say it, because we were thinking about using rather than closing the carbon cycle that way. I would argue if you want to get a ton of carbon out of the ground, you have to show me that another ton has been put away. Air capture and any other methodology you have to put carbon away should generate a certificate of sequestration or a certificate of negative emissions. And if you choose to get carbon out of the ground, you have to pay for one. And I think as a society, we have to pay for more of them because we have to basically take the carbon back, which we have put out since 1800 to today. So we could enter on a program where we are trying to catch up with emissions 4 years at a time.
Yeah, so we have a question right here.
Can I-
Klaus, can you give the elevator pitch on the technology for direct air extraction from the air?
Everybody who does it has some chemical sorbent which binds CO2 as the air blows over it. We are special in that we use the wind to do it, so we are passive. We have leaves like a tree, surfaces where as the wind blows over it binds. Our particular sorbent has the feature that when it's dry, it has a very high affinity to CO2. And if you make it wet, it releases it at a 500 times higher partial pressure. So we can get to about 5% CO2, of 5% of an atmosphere of CO2 in the release, either as pure CO2 at low pressure or mixed, for example, for a greenhouse with the CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's a simple chemical process. Think of it like a sail standing in the wind. It loads up with CO2. I collect it into a box, make it wet, release the CO2,
And what
process
about
that on.
What about the scalability? Because quite frankly, I've seen, there are a number of variations, and I won't
Yes.
elaborate on them, in terms of dealing with renewable energies, but they're not scalable. Do you know what I
Yes,
mean?
I think
They're
we are.
cute. They're-
I think we are
Tell me about the
scalable.
scalability from your perspective.
I think we are scalable. If you want a 1 ton a day device, I can tell you that is roughly the size of a shipping container. So think of it as a truck, trailer truck. If you wanted to cope with current emissions, you would need 100 million of those. If you wanted to pull 100 ppm back over 50 years, that would be 100 million of them. So either way, think of 100 million such units as a huge number, which you would need to actually cope seriously with a problem. That, to me, is full scale.
That's scale, yeah.
Okay, now hang on. If you now take, say they last 10 years, that means every year you have to build 10 million. We are building 80 million trucks and light cars and light trucks every year. Shanghai Harbor processes 30 million full shipping containers. So there's an industrial production capacity not far from Shanghai, which manages to produce enough goods to be equivalent to 3 times of what we are talking about. And you certainly, given 1 billion cars on the planet, I'll find you enough parking spots for 100 million such units without them interfering with each other. So I would argue you can reach scale, and I would emphasize you would reach scale through mass manufacturing and mass production rather than by scaling up individual units. I think factory production would work.
So Klaus, thanks very much for that. Ellen, I want to get back to you because you had something you wanted to get in here as a close to this panel.
So to the earlier question, one thing about what we're talking about here and the fact that CO2 is everywhere, we no longer have the issue of you have to go to certain places and protect certain places because you could do it anywhere on Earth. And it is completely scalable because there are you can do these technologies with very common elements. You don't have to have, any rare elements. And one point, like carbon, there's more carbon in a lithium-ion battery than there's lithium. So between the scale and being democratic, being able to do it anywhere, we can avoid a lot of geopolitical conflicts.
Arizona would be big enough to collect all the CO2, but I wouldn't recommend you to do it that way.
No, it'd be better to actually do it everywhere.
All right, so we've got a new industry, and we're going to be out there. So thank you very much to the panel, and thank you to the audience for your questions.
Nice work. Thank you very much.